Let me introduce our next speaker. Dr. Alexander Erath is co-founder of Erweco, a research-based consultancy that specializes in data and simulation driving transport planning. He's also a principal investigator at the Future Cities Laboratory of the Singapore ETH Center. His main research interests are surveying and modeling of travel behavior, transport simulation, and the interplay between spatial planning, urban design, and mobility pattern. His most recent research project include the development of MAT-SIM Singapore, an agent-based transport simulation model, and its application to evaluate urban mobility futures with self-driving vehicles. Bike to the Future is exploring the application of a virtual reality cycling simulator to gauge stress and comfort levels of different urban cycling infrastructures. Welcome, Alexander Erath. Very much looking forward to your presentation. I hope everything works.
Me too. Thanks so much. I think this is one of the nicest rooms to have a presentation, because if I'm too boring, you still have the ballet of Jane Jacobs just outside the windows. But I hope not to bore you too much. Before I start, maybe quick words to the Future Cities Laboratory. Why Singapore? Why I'm now in Switzerland and so on. So the Future Cities Laboratory has been established by ETH Zurich in Singapore because ETH has been invited by the Singapore government, who sees urban development as one of the key kind of challenges, but also opportunities in terms of knowledge development, and has invited ETH, among other universities, also TU Munich, to establish research centers focusing on question of urbanization. The Future Cities Laboratory does this with the aim of contributing to a sustainable global urban development through science, by design, and in place. And maybe quickly I have a few words to this. So through science means really a lot of the discussions also we had today in the second session is about, I think that, it could be that, and my opinion is, we want to sort of inject these discussions with evidence, with real scientific evidence, quantifications. Obviously, sometimes you need to simplify things, that's also a problem, but still that we have this academic sort of foundation if we claim certain things. The second is by design. Certain things actually you can understand the problem, but it's not enough to quantify. You really need to have like that genius moment of bringing things together, that the conflicts of interest don't exist anymore, but they actually are sort of superimposing and helping each other. And then in places, all this is nice, you have science, you have design, but if you can't like bring it to the ground, it doesn't help anybody. So the Future Cities Laboratory is really about bringing things like science and design to the ground in collaborative projects. That can be in Singapore, that can be in Southeast Asia, but gradually we are moving sort of globally, and we also want to come back to Europe at some point, and so I'm very happy to be here with you, coming from Singapore, living in Switzerland, being now in Munich, and talking to you about some of the projects that we did there. So I was directing the Engaging Mobility group at the Future Cities Laboratory. I'm still engaged in one or the other project where I drew most of the work I'm presenting here. So this is not my own business. This is talking for ETH in Singapore. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at two technology drivers that I think can have a big impact on how we envision and plan the future of mobility. And those two are, one, autonomous vehicles. I think everybody agrees that this is one of the biggest drivers, even if we sit, or especially if we sit in a garage, so to say. And the second is virtual reality, which we have already today, and can be actually used, I think, to envision and help planning quite substantially. And I'm just going to present a project that we did on that called Back to the Future in Singapore. So it's always good to look back if we want to understand where we're headed to. And I invite you to look back with me to a movie from 1958 done by Disney on the future of mobility. It's called The Magic Highway. Let's start.
Tomorrow's living in spacious, well-planned communities will be closely integrated with the highway system. In the private motor port, the family car is automatically washed, dried, and refueled. As father chooses the route in advance on a push-button selector, electronics take over complete control. Progress can be accurately checked on a synchronized scanning map. With no driving responsibility, the family relaxes together. En route, business conferences are conducted by television. On entering the city, the family separates. Father to his office, mother and son to the shopping center. These new forms of vehicles will bring about special purpose roadways. Office buildings will combine unique parking and elevator services. From his private parking space, father will probably
work while the kids and the wife are shopping. Well, 60 years later, we have a Women's Day, luckily, which we celebrated yesterday. Women work, that's also, I think, quite an invention, much better than the autonomous vehicles that we still talk about, but not yet there. But still, I find it interesting. Then just recently, I think like last week or so, I bumped into this. IDEO, one of the famous design firms, has come up with, it's a beautifully made website. I really can recommend you to go there. Just Google Future of Automobility and IDEO and you will be guided there. Showcases their ideas, their visions of autonomous mobility or autonomous future. And we see now the wife is working, maybe the man sits at home and does something else, but she is working in the car. She sits alone there. And then there is even working pods that you can move wherever you like them to be. Obviously, it's driven by the Silicon Valley flavor of ideas. It's in front of Alcatraz where you can park your working pod, and that working pod can then obviously be combined with other working pods, and you have interdisciplinary workspaces and so on. But you can clearly see that it's very car-centric. This debate about autonomous vehicles, it's all cars, 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 and if that continues, we might get into the same problems that we have sort of sorted out for ourselves over the last 50 years, thinking too much about cars and just replace them with a new technology, autonomous vehicles. If designers, but also traffic engineers, talk about mobility, often the discussion is not so much about mobility, but about the efficiency of traffic. And this is also one of the sort of ground ideas of this illustration, which is already quite old. It's from 1913, of a vision of how a city, for example, such as New York, could be organized. Many layers separate the modes, and even though you have, in terms of the configuration of land uses, you just stack them above each other. So to have a mixed-use city, but still the separation of modes. Now, last year in Singapore, the government came up with this graph. This is their vision of a future mobility with autonomous vehicles. We see exactly the same. We see stacked up land uses, although this is also on the horizontal level with residences. Then we have playgrounds, which are obviously exactly designed as the playgrounds that exist today in Singapore. And then we have stacked up each other different shared mobility, autonomous mobility. So in Singapore, it's very much the discussion, well, those guys in the Silicon Valley, they want to sell as many cars and they have different land use patterns. Let them go. We do things differently. We do things the Asian way, and we just have shared mobility. So they are really thinking about Singapore as a very strong government arm to sort of ban or make urban quarters to ban all private cars, but replace sort of the private mobility or individual mobility with shared mobility, which you can order like an elevator. You push the button and then some pod will come. Now, planners from the West Coast in the United States, this is from Parsons and Brinkerhoffs and WSP, Farrell's, they came together and drew this vision of an autonomous city, which is shared space, all the things that people think is very good and nice to have. But then, does this work? I don't think so, because I never would drive along this road with a car. It's just too slow. It doesn't do, the car doesn't support it in its abilities. And also for the pedestrians and the cyclists, if you want to cross a street, and you always need to watch out for those cars, and those cars actually are programmed in a way that you actually can just go in and stop the car because it's very defensive, while other car drivers are a bit more pushy. So you can actually take hostage of autonomous vehicles. And this is a big problem if we design cities, that people like activists that just don't take hostage of how those cars are being programmed and must be programmed. So, but one thing will remain, which is sort of the logic of geometry. And the logic of geometry tells you that you need a certain space to move a certain amount of people in different modes or different vehicles. And this is a nice little graph that came out of a European Union research project where PTV Group was part of it. This is a software company from Karlsruhe, recently bought by Porsche, interestingly, Porsche Holdings, and is the world market leader in transport simulation softwares. And so let's see which claim will clear first. So we have 200 people in different modes of transport with the actual like occupancy rates and so on, so it's all proper. And let's start. And as you already sort of predict, all lanes will clear within the same amount of time. But what's obvious is how much space actually each of those modes requires. And this is pretty tremendous and tells you also a lot about the autonomous future or autonomous mobility future of cities. It won't be just cars, it won't be just like shared pods. We still need like those backbone U-Bahnen, metros and S-Bahnen. It's just a geometric problem which we otherwise can't solve. It's like the physics of transport simulation. Now, today's debate on autonomous vehicles is quite multifaceted. There is almost like a separation, a separation of like bipartisan. We have on the one hand people who think this is the best that happened ever to humanity, and other people more from the urban planning background and maybe environmentalists are claiming, oh no, this is the worst that can happen. This just decreases the cost of driving or mobility, so we will have induced demand, we have more urban sprawl, and so on. And I think both sides are right in their argumentation. So the argument that if you have cheaper transport, what we have seen in the past is that people will even further move out to have their house in the green, in an affordable space. It will happen. So the question more is, we know all how, in which direction it can go, is how we sort of govern this process. Because this is not ultimately a technology that just like is put on us. It's really us, the society, both in cities but also in the rural space, how we're going to work with this tool and how we want to use this tool or technology to actually improve things and not make them worse and make the same mistakes that we have done in the past. Now, the second, like this was like envisioning the future with autonomous vehicles. Now, I come from transport engineering and transport simulation. There we also have a contribution. We do not work that much with visualizations, but we work with simulations. Simulations allow us to quantify different potential scenarios to showcase also the politicians, but also citizens, what-if scenarios. What if we do this? What if we organize autonomous vehicles or mobility in general in this or in the other way? And how we do this is with agent-based transport simulation. Now, agent-based transport simulation is, you can sort of imagine it as a database. And in this database, we have one line for each person that we model in a certain area. That can be Munich, that can be Singapore, that can be whole of Switzerland. At the moment, we go up to like 15, 20 million people of a region that we can model. And for each person, we try to model a typical day. So it's a bit like playing Groundhog Day, where the day repeats and repeats. So everybody does the same every day, and we change the system and look or want to understand how people react to different mobility offers. So there we have 3 different people. We have a business lady, mostly interested in like effective transport during the day, maybe here and then a taxi, can afford it. We have the guy in the middle who is more interested in having a nice shuttle between the clubs. And then we have our uncle, who is waving all the time because we tend to forget him as he does not produce that many trips. Maybe he doesn't produce any trip, maybe he just walks to the market and back and that's it. But he suffers from the trips of the others, by the emissions, by the space they take for parking, for separation and so on. And so I think we need to model all of them, even if they don't generate traffic, but just to understand where they are and how they are affected by the traffic of the other people. So if we do this now for an entire city, and we model not so much only the trips, but more so the activity, so where do you live, where do you work, where do you go for shopping, then what's emerging is the traffic patterns of an entire city, and we can change it according to whatever plans are of interest. We can change, replace the existing cars with autonomous vehicles. We can change and say bikes are now much more attractive because we have dedicated bicycle lanes. We can change and add a new metro line and so on. And just to showcase this, how this sort of looks like, we also learned a lot from the interdisciplinary work with designers. We created this visualization, which showcases the first activity patterns. So whenever a light flashes, as new activity starts, which is geolocated in Singapore, so you see the city center flashing in white where all the work activities are, and then this is during the morning, 8:30, so most people are at home or at work, but now also shopping starts. And we now fly through, and as we saw until now just activities, obviously people need to travel between different activities, and this is essentially what we see, and what we are mostly interested is the traffic patterns and how the network infrastructure and the different transport supply offers actually impact the choices of people. So what you see is different vehicle types, so public transport and private transport, and what's sort of now the research direction or research challenge is really to improve the software, which is open source, and augment it so that it can also model autonomous vehicle on a big scale, which is actually a computational challenge, because you need to think about dispatching, how many vehicles you need where, how much space it requires to get people in and off board those vehicles. So this is what's going on at the moment in the labs. Now, what other people are doing with similar software, for example, the OECD, is to already test different scenarios. Now, just recently, they published a report on Helsinki, which is quite interesting. So the basic assumption is to get rid of all cars at once, with today's travel demand patterns, and replace all car trips with 2 forms of transport. One is a 6-seater taxi that is on demand, door to door, or a bit bigger taxi buses that go, I think, till 15 people, which you can take at any street corner, but you need to book 30 minutes in advance that you want to be picked up and brought somewhere. Now the result is you only need 4% of the vehicles, because as you can see it outside, most cars are actually parked most of the time during the day. There is a 37% lower level of congestion, which is actually not that much if you compare to you need only 4% of the cars. This is mainly due that those cars need to travel empty a lot. So they need to, for example, bring people into the city center where the jobs are, and then need to travel out empty to pick up new people and so on. You can save about the same amount of CO2 emissions. And actually the waiting and travel time is less than today's public transport, but it's also a bit hypothetical because some people actually are faster than public transport today, taking their car, and those people might not be very supportive to such a completely new system. But still, it's impressive. There is a bit of a but. There is no induced demand, so if less waiting time and travel time, that means normally people would take more trips or longer trips or more activities and so on. That's not considered. There is no consideration of the parking the space required for dwelling. For example, in front of a railway station, to get people into such small pods just wouldn't work. You need to have bigger vehicles with more doors to actually get people away. Or think about a football stadium, the Allianz Arena, with just those pods, it just doesn't work. But still, it's an impressive, I think, thought experiment which is based on evidence and simulation to bring the discussion a step further. Now, to conclude, very briefly, a different topic. This is sort of my research hobby, if I can call this. This was just a fun project that we came up with in Singapore, which now still, I think, develops and can develop, is the idea what we can do with virtual reality in planning. And in Singapore, I lived there for 6 years. I was very upset by the level of cycling infrastructure. So I thought, okay, if I can't build it myself, then let's build it in virtual reality and see what happens, see what people think, what politicians think. Obviously, politicians, there is a sort of a pro cycling environment nowadays in Singapore, with even the Prime Minister being photographed on a bicycle, but still, to support that development. So the research question is, how can we effectively generate realistic streetscapes in VR, because that can be very work intensive. I won't touch this. How can it be used actually to better engage the public and inform them about plans, but not only inform them, but also get feedback to improve on plans before you actually build it? Because to build it in virtual reality is a lot of work, but it's still less work than to build it in concrete. And then, can you actually measure mobility behavior with those tools? And what are the limits? So the first thing to answer the second research question was to go on parking day, which is once a year, that you can use one parking space and do something else with it. So we went there and we put 2 bicycles instead of on a parking lot, and we invited people to take a test ride through a potential future of their urban quarter. So what we did is we really started the VR experience at that spot and led them through around the block. We obviously advertised that a bit, so this is the environment as it looks like today, with the photo montage, with the new cycling lane, and we also got a lot of media attention through this, which was obviously also a bit orchestrated. Now, to give you an impression what it looked like is, I'll play you this video. So this is how we modeled the street as if it is today, and now we will fade in the new version. And we had 3 street segments, and we always gradually improved the level of the cycling infrastructure. So this is just shared space with a bit of paint. Now we go to a completely segregated and separated cycling path, which is at the moment just a walkway, but then the makeover is also a bit greener and nicer, and we have a bidirectional cycling path. And then, as we will turn around, sort of through the main street in this urban quarter in Singapore, it's not all like high-rise, there's also urban quarters like this, which is very car-oriented at the moment, I mean parking-oriented, as you will see. And we sort of made a makeover and converted this to an urban square, which is actually should be, because the building on the left you can see is a market, and on the right you have lots of ground floor usage. So we thought that should be this sort of urban or town center, and there you could actually cycle through, and we invited the people just to have the ride and give us feedback, whether the virtual reality helped them to understand the plans better. So we also handed them out like normal plans, normal renderings, and it really showed us that if you let people just use this virtual reality, they have a much better understanding as if you give them plans. Plans is something that for us professionals is almost as good as virtual reality, but if you're not like trained in interpreting those plans, virtual reality can really help to convey the story of your designs. We also asked them whether they would cycle on the infrastructure as it is today, or as we envisage it for tomorrow. And we asked also with a twist, if you were cycling with your 10-year-old son, daughter, cousin, or whatsoever, just someone who's 10-year-old, and before there would be, like on the first segment, only 10%, and now with the makeover it would be 44%. And with the third segment, the urban town square, also 11% because there's a lot of parking activities going on there, up to 74%, which sort of brought us to the direction, okay, let's go one step further and this was just the 360-degree videos which we showed them on the bicycle. Now the newest generation of our Bike to the Future project is that you sit on a bicycle and you actually can brake and you can pedal and you can steer and you sort of fly or cycle through virtual environments. And with virtual reality, what we can do, what's so difficult as a researcher, is to control the actual environment you are exposing people with. So we can just have different street configurations and really see what works, what makes people considering a street safe enough for cycling. And there the important thing is who. Because I cycle everywhere. I cycle even in New York or maybe Munich. No, Munich is pretty fine, I think. But many other people are very sensible to how the streets are configured and designed, and we really can showcase this to decision makers, but also citizens and citizens each other, and I think this is very helpful in towards a participatory integration of design and planning. Thank you very much.